Continue the discussion that we had yesterday of name, scope, and bindings. Okay, so we talked about what do you mean by name and why we require a name to call or use a certain object in programming. We need to name that object. Okay, and once we name the object, the association between object and name is referred to as the binding. Okay, can I reuse the same name in my program? We saw yesterday one example of that, where in function overloading, we name same function, give same name to a function, and still be able to use them when we are writing the code. So it becomes the responsibility of the compiler and the executor of the code at the execution time to decide upon which function name with the particular parameters, that is the prototype, which prototype function should be selected amongst the three prototypes that we have. Okay, so naming is a very important thing with respect to programming. Certain names are unique, that like keywords, like maybe some standard library file names, they are unique, and generally they have a lifetime over the entire execution cycle of the program. But certain names can be reused. For example, I can reuse a variable name in a different place in the code. Now I need to understand what is the meaning of lifetime of an object. Okay, so the period of time between the creation and the destruction of a name to object binding is called as binding's lifetime. So there are various things that we need to learn. Okay, sorry for this mistake. This is one thing. So this is the first and foremost thing that this slide reads. So what we are talking about? We are talking about programming objects lifetime. Programming objects a lifetime काय असतं. This concept is going to provide us some understanding about what do you mean by a scope of an object. आपण व्हेरिएबलच्या बाबतीत बऱ्याचदा स्कोप काय आहे त्या व्हेरिएबलचा हे बऱ्याचदा वापरतो किंवा यूज करतो वर्ड, किंवा एखादा व्हेरिएबल आपल्या फंक्शन मध्ये असतो आणि मेन प्रोग्राम मध्ये तो व्हेरिएबल डिक्लेअर केलेला नसतो, तो आपण मेन प्रोग्राम मध्ये वापरू शकत नाही. हे तुम्ही सी मध्ये बघितलं असेल. यू मस्ट हॅव सीन दिस इन सी प्रोग्रामिंग. व्हाइल यू यूज अ पर्टिक्युलर व्हेरिएबल इनसाइड अ फंक्शन, व्हेन यू राइट अ फंक्शन and you have used a variable inside it, that variable is not used, or that variable can't be used without declaration inside your main function. Okay, certain variables that you declare outside of all the blocks in C program, they are accessible everywhere in all the other blocks, which are called as global variables. For instance, अगर जर मी हॅश इन्क्लूड करून झाल्यावर एक व्हेरिएबल डिफाइन केला जी मॅक्झिमम साईज डिफाइन करते, समजा एखाद्या स्टॅकची किंवा क्यूची, जर तुम्ही डेटा स्ट्रक्चर्स अँड अल्गोरिथम्सचे काही प्रोग्राम बघितले असतील तर त्याच्यामध्ये तुम्ही काही ग्लोबल डिक्लेरेशन्स करता, ते व्हेरिएबल्स सगळीकडे प्रोग्राम मधल्या सगळ्या फंक्शन्स मध्ये तुम्ही वापरू शकता. दॅट इज बिकॉज दॅट व्हेरिएबल इज लाईव्ह थ्रू आउट द कोड. कुठलं तुम्ही कोणताही ब्लॉक एक्झिक्यूट करत असलात तरी त्या पर्टिक्युलर व्हेरिएबलचा त्या पर्टिक्युलर व्हेरिएबलचा स्कोप जो आहे तो लाईव्ह असतो. हे आपण व्हेरिएबलच्या बाबतीत म्हणतो. तसंच the scope does not only limit itself to a variable, scope also limits itself to all the kind of programming objects. मी कोणता पर्टिक्युलर फंक्शन कुठल्या पर्टिक्युलर ब्लॉक मध्ये वापरू शकतो, कुठे ते वापरू शकत नाही, याचा सुद्धा डिसिजन स्कोपच्या बेसिसवरती घेतलं जातं. जर त्या फंक्शनचा स्कोप असेल तर आपण ते यूज करू शकतो. सो स्कोप एखाद्या गोष्टीचा, ऑब्जेक्टचा, प्रोग्रामिंग ऑब्जेक्टचा, इफ आय वॉन्ट टू डिसाइड, I need to first understand what do you mean by an object being alive. Okay, how do I define a lifetime of object? When do I say that an object is created and when do I say the object is destroyed? Okay, that is what we are trying to understand through this slide. Okay, so the first bullet of the slide reads like this. I hope the bullet is readable. Font वाढवायला पाहिजे का मी? नहीं है ना? ओके, ठीक है, रीडेबल है ना? ठीक है. द पॉइंट ऑफ द टाइम बिटवीन क्रिएशन अँड डिस्ट्रक्शन ऑफ नेम टू ऑब्जेक्ट बाइंडिंग. नेम टू ऑब्जेक्ट बाइंडिंग म्हणजे मी एखादं नाव एखाद्या ऑब्जेक्टला दिलंय आणि ते ऑब्जेक्ट जे आहे ते यांचं असोसिएशन होणं याला बाइंडिंग म्हणतात. वी हॅव सीन ऑलरेडी. सो व्हेनेवर आय असोसिएट द नेम टू दॅट ऑब्जेक्ट, that is the point where the life of the object is, I should say, the object gets incarnated. Object चा जन्म होतो, I should say. Okay, that is, the object is created at that time. And when the object gets destroyed, at that's the time when the life of the object is complete. Okay, the time when the binding is done, the object becomes live, and at the time the binding is removed, the object is dead. So that is how I can define the lifetime of an object. Now you will feel that every object in my program will be live after the binding is made, but that's not the case, because program execution does not follow a straight way. I may have been executing a subroutine, और उस सबरूटीन में दूसरे कोई फंक्शन को कॉल अगर आपने किया तो वो दूसरा फंक्शन का जो कोड है उसके ऊपर आपका एग्जीक्यूशन कंट्रोल चला जाएगा, एंड देन यू विल एग्जीक्यूट दैट कोड, एंड देन यू विल कम बैक टू द एग्जिस्टिंग कोड. नाउ व्हेन दिस हैपेंस, you might have heard a word called as context switch happens. Currently जो मैं एग्जीक्यूट कर रहा था फंक्शन, उसमें जो मैंने वेरिएबल्स यूज किए हैं, वो वेरिएबल्स जो मैंने कंप्यूटेशन अभी तक किया है, वो पार्शियल कंप्यूटेशन, that is the partial state of computation, is preserved separately on the stack, and then I reload the variables which are live in the new scope or new block of code that I have made call to. Okay, तो ये जो हो रहा है, this is what this actually when happens, what happens is certain name to object bindings might get destroyed temporarily because I'm changing the execution scope. This especially happens when I have a situation where, I'll just give you a situation so that you will understand what is going around. Say suppose I'm writing a function f1. Okay, there are I'm defining that function. Since you know the C syntax, I'm using the C syntax. I may have declared, say, variable a, and I may have stored certain value 10 in that variable. Then I may have another function which is f1, okay, which I have actually defined inside this functions block. Okay, particularly ऐसा बहुत कम बार होता है कि हम लोग ऐसे करते हैं, but maybe what I've done is I have defined, means I have written the code of this function inside this, and maybe I have used another variable whose name is again a. That may happen sometimes. Okay, in a very large program this is very natural to happen, and I may have another variable, say int b, c, and some more variables, I don't know. Okay, so there are certain computations occurring here, and I may have this function to return an integer. This function is returning an integer, and this returns say a, sorry, this returns say a. Okay, so it will be accessing a in line number 13. Maybe at some point in the code, this program calculates a is equal to b plus c. That's some expression. Okay, and maybe this has a variable c is equal to a, and over here again it is a is equal to 10. Okay, so I'm writing a short partial program. It's not a complete program. You can consider it to be a codelet rather than a code. And here I'm actually calling function f1. So both functions are named f1. Sorry, my mistake. Calling function f2, and probably this function is return a. Maybe this a is not defined, and this is something like this. This becomes more appropriate example now. Okay, so now there is this function f2 is defined inside the block of function f1. f1 च्या आत त्याची डेफिनेशन केलेली आहे. आय एम कॉलिंग इट इनसाइड द ब्लॉक इटसेल्फ. that ब्लॉकच्या आतच मी f2 ला कॉल करतोय. and f2 is going to return a. This function is also going to return a. When I make the call to function f2, complicated आहे, असा complicated scenario खूप कमी वेळा येतो, but to understand the concept of variable and its scope or function and its scope, we are writing this thing. Okay, now consider that when I reach this line number 6 for execution, this variable a, okay, so this a, the name a is associated with a different variable than ये line number 3 पे जो variable a है उसके. Okay, but when I'm executing this internal code, जब मैं ये internal code execute कर रहा हूँ, at that time is this a alive? No, this a is not alive. Why it is not alive? Because when I come to execution of f2, I stop executing f1. When I come to execution of f2, I stop executing f1 and then I go to execute f2. While I am executing f2, the variable a that I have defined outside of f2 is not accessible inside it. Okay, so this a I will always be evaluating as a compiler or as a program executor. This expression a is equal to b plus c will always assign b plus c value, that is 30 plus 10 40 value, to this a and not to this a. ये आपको पता है क्योंकि आपने C programming language सीखी है. Okay, this happens because the binding between name a and this value 10 and the memory address where these two things are associated with, that binding is disassociated when I call function f2, because inside f2 this variable binding is not having scope. Okay, so what is a lifetime of a variable? A lifetime of a variable is point when it gets created up to point when it gets destroyed. तो ये a destroy कब होगा? जब मैं ये subroutine से बाहर निकलूंगा. Because this is a subroutine, there will be another function called as main probably, which will be calling this function, right? Wherein we will be calling this function. So I will be calling f1 here from the main. So whenever I call f1 from main, this will come to life. This variable will get created. The association of name a to the memory address of 4 bytes will be done. Value 10 will be assigned to that those memory addresses that will be stored over there in those memory addresses. But that will be disassociated when I reach to line number 13. Because in the line number 13, I'm making call to f2 function. So while I am executing line number 13 and I have just made call to f2, and I'll start executing from here onwards. And as I execute these steps, my earlier binding that was created, the association of name a to that memory address and the values, that is currently disassociated. So temporarily the variable does not remain live until I execute this line number 13 of the subroutine f1. Once that line is over and I have a return value, this association re-exists. It starts all over again. Okay, so now please understand scope of variable a, this one that is outside of the f2. So I would refer to this variable a as outside of f2. Okay, and this a as inside of f2. Okay, to distinguish them from each other. Okay, तो ये outside of f2 वाला जो a है उसका अगर आप lifetime देखोगे तो when you are executing any of the steps between step number 5 to step number 12 or line number 5 to line number 12, it won't be live. Okay, but when you are executing step number 1, 2, 3, 4 or 13, 14, 15, it will be live. Okay, inside f2 वाला जो a है, that variable is going to be live when we enter f2, that is from line number 5 till we exit f2, that is line number 12. So this is the lifetime of the inside f2a, and lifetime of outside f2a is this these three lines and these three lines. Okay, whenever I'm executing this stuff, the outside f2a is not live. So this is how a compiler would also require to understand when a binding is live, when the binding is not live. Okay, so that is about a binding of a variable, because it is easier to give you an example of a variable. I'm giving you an example of a variable, but you need to understand